Have you ever wondered why the Korean War is often referred to as the Forgotten War? In the grand theater of the 20th century, it was a conflict that took a back seat in the collective global memory, overshadowed by the dramatic narratives of the Second World War and the Cold War. Yet, this conflict between North and South Korea, which erupted in 1950, was no less significant. It was a war that brought the international powers to a new battleground, a war that divided the Korean peninsula along an imaginary line, the 38th parallel. The Korean War was not just a regional conflict, but a global event that reshaped the geopolitical landscape. Yet despite its significance, it remains an unresolved question, a puzzle that still begs for answers. So let's delve into the chronicles of this forgotten war and uncover its untold stories. The stage for the Korean War was set long before the first shots were fired. The peninsula of Korea, rich in history and culture, was thrust into a crucible of conflict, not of its own making, but as a consequence of the greater ideological struggle that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War. Following the defeat of Japan in 1945, Korea, a former Japanese colony, was divided along the 38th parallel into two zones of occupation. The north was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the south by the United States. This division was meant to be temporary, a mere stepping stone towards an independent, unified Korea. Yet, it would become the birthplace of a conflict that would last for years. The North and South quickly evolved into starkly different societies. North Korea, under the influence of the Soviet Union, adopted a socialist model, with the state controlling all aspects of life. The South, meanwhile, under US guidance, embraced a capitalist system, promoting individual freedoms and market-based economics. These ideological differences created a chasm between the two Koreas that only grew wider with time. Efforts were made to reunify the country peacefully. Yet these attempts were marred by political disagreements, foreign interference, and the growing ideological divide. The hopes for a united Korea, free from foreign control, seemed to fade with each passing day. Tensions grew, fueled by border skirmishes and political propaganda. The North, bolstered by Soviet military aid, and the South, supported by the US, both claimed to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. Each saw the other as a threat to their existence and ideology. And so the stage was set. Two Koreas, each backed by a superpower, each with a distinct way of life and governance, locked in a struggle for control of a peninsula they both called home. The world watched, holding its breath as the tensions mounted and the drumbeats of war echoed louder and louder. Armed with foreign support and distinct ideologies, the stage was set for a conflict that would shake the peninsula. A conflict that would not only alter the course of Korean history but also shape the geopolitical landscape of the world for years to come. In the early hours of June 25, 1950, the relative peace of the peninsula was shattered. Suddenly the calm was replaced by the thunderous sounds of artillery fire, tanks, and marching boots. North Korean forces, emboldened by a desire for reunification under their terms, had launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea. This marked the beginning of a conflict that would drastically alter the course of history. The North Korean army, equipped with Soviet tanks and heavy artillery, crossed the 38th parallel, the line drawn in the sand separating the North from the South. The invasion was swift and coordinated. Within days, the capital city of Seoul had fallen into North Korean hands. The South Korean army, underprepared and overwhelmed, was forced to retreat, losing ground rapidly to the advancing northern forces. But the South was not alone in this fight. The international community, led by the United Nations, was quick to respond. The United Nations Security Council, in a historic move, passed a resolution condemning the North Korean invasion and called for an immediate cessation of hostilities. When the North Korean forces ignored this call, the Security Council took a further step, authorizing a United Nations command to aid South Korea. The United States, under the leadership of President Harry S. Truman, answered this call to action. American troops were soon deployed on the Korean peninsula, not as conquerors but as defenders of a democratic nation under attack. Other nations too joined this international force, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and more, all united by a common purpose: to halt the spread of aggression and restore peace. The rapid advancement of North Korean forces had caught the world off guard, yet the urgency of the United Nations intervention signaled a new era in international politics, with nations across the globe ready to take collective action against acts of aggression. As international forces rallied to South Korea's defense, the conflict was set to escalate beyond the borders of the peninsula. This was not just a war between two Koreas anymore. It was a global conflict, a struggle between ideologies, and a test of the world's resolve to uphold peace and sovereignty. The war was far from a straightforward battle between North and South. As the conflict escalated, the global superpowers couldn't ignore the strategic importance of the Korean peninsula. It was in this context that China made a dramatic entrance into the war, turning the tides in favor of the North. The Chinese intervention was not a hasty decision. It was a calculated move that would significantly alter the direction of the war. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, under the leadership of General Peng Dehuai, launched a massive counteroffensive in late October of 1950. This sudden incursion pushed the United Nations forces southward, reversing the gains they had made in the preceding months. Amidst this turbulent period, one event stood out as a turning point: the Battle of Incheon. In September of 1950, General Douglas MacArthur led a daring amphibious invasion at Incheon, a port city far behind North Korean lines. This strategic masterstroke not only cut off North Korean supply lines but also allowed the UN forces to recapture the South Korean capital, Seoul. This victory provided the momentum for the UN forces to push deep into North Korean territory. However, this advance was not without its pitfalls. The UN forces soon found themselves stretched thin and vulnerable to the Chinese counteroffensive. It was a classic case of overreach, and the consequences were severe. The following months saw a series of advances and retreats from both sides, each trying to gain an upper hand. The UN forces, despite their initial success, struggled to maintain their momentum in the face of the relentless Chinese counterattacks. The North Koreans, on the other hand, were determined to regain their lost territory, backed by the might of the Chinese army. In the grand scheme of the Korean War, this period was a pivotal one. It showcased the strategic complexity of the conflict, where the tides of war were continuously shifting, and victory was never assured. The war was a seesaw of advances and retreats, with both sides struggling to gain the upper hand. Despite the fierce fighting and heavy casualties, the war seemed to be going nowhere. This was the grim reality of the Korean War from 1951 to 1953. Both sides had dug in, unwilling to yield an inch, resulting in a stalemate that lasted for 2 years. This was a war of attrition, a grinding, brutal slog where gains were measured not in miles, but in yards. It was during this time that the first whispers of a possible peace began to circulate. The prospect was tantalizing but fraught with complexities. Who would mediate? Where would the borders lie? And most importantly, how could two sides, so deeply entrenched in their ideologies, find common ground? Negotiations began in earnest in July of 1951, in the village of Panmunjom, but progress was slow. Each side had their demands and neither was willing to compromise. The talks were often heated, and more than once they broke down completely. But despite the setbacks, the discussions went on. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the war raged on. Soldiers fought and died even as their leaders talked of peace. It was a cruel irony, a testament to the senseless waste of war. Finally, after 2 years of negotiations, a breakthrough. On the 27th of July, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. It was not a peace treaty, but it effectively ended the hostilities. The fighting stopped, and a demilitarized zone, a buffer, was established along the 38th parallel. But it was a bitter victory. The borders were essentially unchanged from where they had been at the start of the war. The cost in terms of lives lost and resources expended was staggering. The guns fell silent, but peace remained elusive. The war ended, not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice, a temporary ceasefire that continues to this day. Despite the cessation of hostilities, the Korean War has never officially ended, a haunting reminder of a conflict that tore a nation apart. Over 70 years have passed, yet the echoes of the Korean War still resonate. We've journeyed through the unresolved question of a divided Korea, the prelude to war, the outbreak and escalation, the turning of tides, and the stalemate and armistice. From a once united nation, the Korean peninsula was torn asunder, becoming a battleground for ideologies. The Korean War, a conflict sparked by geopolitical tension, has had a lasting impact. The scars of war still mar the landscape and the hearts of the Korean people. North and South Korea, separated by a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone, continue to exist in a state of tension, a haunting reminder of a war that ended, but never truly concluded. The world watches, holding its breath, as the drama of the Korean Peninsula unfolds, a living testament to a war that refuses to be forgotten. And so, the Forgotten War remains unresolved, its stories etched indelibly into the annals of history.